Alright, as you can see from the title, this is my EDC 250 Introduction to Learning Disability Screencast, and I am Katie Saylor Wilder. So first off, what is a learning disability? Learning disability is a term used to describe a group of neurological conditions that interfere with a person's learning. LD is an umbrella term for disorders relating to listening, speaking, reading, reasoning, and mathematical calculations. Individuals with LD can have near average, average, or above average intelligence. LD conditions range from mild to severe. They can include attention deficit components, socio-emotional components, and emotional issues. It's called the hidden handicap, and those with LD tend to need early identification, sound remedial teaching, counseling, social skills training, vocational guidance, and on-the-job coaching. So a timeline of the history. So in 1937, a man named Samuel Orton observed reading difficulties in children and noted that there was a continuum of reading disability ranging from mild to severe. And then in 1940, Orton, Gillingham, Stillman, Spalding, and Fernald, a group of people, developed alternative teaching methods for those with trouble reading. In 1940 through the 1960s, LD students were still thought to be slow learners, or they were put into classes for the educably retarded. And then in 1916, research findings found that many children who had been classified as retarded actually had normal intelligence scores when they were tested in a nonverbal format. And then in 1963, LD students were referred to as minimally brain damaged. In 1970, the Public Law 94-142, Education of All Handicapped Children Act, passed through Congress, and it guaranteed a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. In 1987, almost 5% of school children qualified for services under the LD category. And then in 1988, Regular Education Initiative, REI, worked towards the first pull-out programs in inclusion. And in 1990, Congress passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. It was reauthorized in 1997 as well. So 5 leaders in the field of learning disabilities. Talked about one briefly, which was Samuel Orton. He observed reading difficulties, noted that continuum, and actually the Orton Dyslexia Society was named for him in his research. And then those group of researchers, Orton, Gillingham, Stillman, Spalding, and Fernald, developed alternative methods for teaching those students who couldn't learn to read. And then B.F. Skinner, he was a renowned psychologist, is known for his animal and human research that led to behavior modification approaches, and those became very popular in the 1960s. So Public Law 94-142 and Section 504. So PL 94-142 was passed in 1975, and it guarantees a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, to children with disabilities. And then Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It's an anti-discrimination act that requires the needs of students with disabilities to be met just like the needs of the non-disabled are met. So causal factors, there's a strong familia factor. LD can be inherited, can be from difficult pregnancy or delivery or premature birth, prenatal conditions, lack of oxygen or nutrients, maternal use of cigarettes, drugs, or alcohol during pregnancy. So we know that using these things during pregnancy leads to a lot of different disabilities. So postnatal or birth trauma, like a high fever, head trauma, or near drowning. And then early childhood exposure to lead, aluminum, arsenic, mercury, and other neurotoxins. So incidence factors, so these are just like the stats of different diagnoses in the world. So it's known that 3 to 8% of children in the US have ADHD, and 1 in 150 children have autism, and 1 in 94 boys are diagnosed. It's actually a higher number there. More boys than girls are diagnosed as LD, a 3-to-1 ratio, so it tends to be that boys are more identified than girls. 20% of US students have trouble learning to read, which is dyslexia. And then 5 to 15% of the US school population is identified as LD. And then dyslexia, which is 20% of US students, is actually only identified as 1% of the population in Japan and China, but it's also in Venezuela, it's 33%, so it's higher in Venezuela than in the US, but the US is definitely higher than in Japan and China. So primary characteristics of learning disabilities. So we have perceptual deficits, which are not caused by deficits in visual or hearing acuity. They occur because the brain misinterprets sensory information. And then phonological processing deficits, difficulties reading. So 80% of LD students have trouble in the area of reading. And then phonological processing skills include awareness and ability to tease out sounds, ability to learn symbols of language and recognize and recall their sounds, and the ability to generalize this information to oral, written, and reading tasks. So kids who have trouble in these areas obviously can't sound out their words, have trouble recalling what letters are, and being able to make this information oral, written, make it in oral and written forms, or be able to read it. So co-occurring conditions. Co-occurring conditions are conditions that can further handicap an LD student. The 3 most prevalent is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, or Tourette syndrome. So ADHD co-occurs in about 1/3 of LD individuals. Symptoms include, but are not limited to these are not all the symptoms, but impulsivity, inability to complete routine tasks, inability to sit/stand still, overreaction to stimuli, inattention, incessant talking, and disorganization. Conduct disorder can co-occur in individuals with ADHD. Symptoms: a lack of respect for others, cruelty to others or animals, lying, fire setting, denial of responsibility. And then in Tourette syndrome, the symptoms are tics, which can be mild to severe. Mild would be like excessive eye rolling, and severe would be like bursts of profanity. And then possible obsessive behaviors, so like the need for symmetry, anxiety about germs. Tourette syndrome occurs in 1 out of 1,000 children, and it's more often in boys, and it can be accompanied by ADHD and LD. Programs and settings in the least restrictive environment. So, birth, babies who are at risk for a disabling condition. Public schools may provide help, such as counseling, locating services, and parenting advice. And then 2 and younger. So kids who are 2 and younger are referred through doctors for intervention services and specialists. Parents can request the local early intervention team to evaluate their child. Birth to 3 years. State agencies may devise an individualized family service plan. And then 3 to 5 years of age, early intervention team programs. They can be provided for children with LD or developmental delays, and can be provided in the home through a daycare center or a preschool. And then school-age elementary children, least restrictive special education services within a regular classroom. So it would be the personnel come into the classroom, the special educators meet with a regular teacher, the child could go to a resource room for part of the day, or a child could be placed in an LD class for all or part of the day. So programs and settings in the least restrictive environment. Things to note about those. It's the job of the IEP team to determine the amount of and type of service a child needs, and children can also qualify for other services, such as like a speech therapist or an adaptive physical education teacher. Now we're getting on to the brain. So the anatomy and function of the brain. First off, we start with the central nervous system. This includes the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the brain, which in science is known as the cerebral cortex. It uses both electrical and chemical processes to send signals. And then the signals are sent from neuron to neuron by jumping through the synaptic gap. So like a neuron is a single cell, the smallest unit of the CNS, and then the synaptic gap is the space between the two neurons. So those signals are just jumping between that space to the next neuron. So then we have the cerebral cortex. It is divided into two hemispheres, and those hemispheres have frontal lobe, which is responsible for problem solving, the temporal lobe, which is hearing and language, the cerebellum, which is balance and coordination, the occipital lobe, which is visual information, and then the parietal lobe, which is sensory, like taste, touch, pressure, pain. So implications of a brain injury. Brain injuries, including concussions, can be caused by car accidents, falls, sports accidents. The primary impact is so there's two forms of impact during these accidents. So the primary impact is the first impact that causes the brain to hit a part of the skull. So when that first object, or like in a sports accident, when the baseball first hits a person's head, that's the primary impact. And then the secondary impact is the second impact caused from when the force of the first impact causes the brain to move and hit the other part of the skull. So the first impact, baseball hits your head, causes your brain to hit that part of your skull, and then as you're recovering from that, your brain moves and then hits another part of your skull because of the force of the first impact. So the facts about these: girls tend to get more serious concussions than boys. It's believed because of their smaller frames. With multiple concussions, learning and memory attention may be permanently affected. And then repeated brain trauma increases, or as repeated brain trauma increases, it leads to it increases the severity of learning disorders. More facts. The effect of an injury depends on the location and the extent of the injury. So where did it occur and how long did it occur? The individual's neurological maturity. So how old were they and how far were they into their brain development? And the nature and extent of efforts to retrain the brain. So if they underwent an injury, was there any form of medical treatment to help with that? And then early brain damage in a certain area can cause, it can alter the neuroanatomy, function, neurochemistry, and growth patterns of other brain systems. Traumatic brain injuries result in diminished working memory and attention span. There's higher rates of depression and sleeping problems in psychiatric conditions such as anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's supposed to be an etc. in there, but there isn't. Whoops. The brain and autism. Autism is a neurological disorder that severely affects development. Autism causes problems with language and social interaction, trouble with communication, and socially appropriate behaviors. Autism is heritable, meaning it follows a genetic path. And then some studies suggest that the same cerebral areas that become reduced in boys with autism may also play a role in social deficits, cognitive deficits, and motor problems. And I got this directly out of my book, which you see cited there. Basically, that means in the area of the brain that is reduced with boys and autism, so it's part of the brain that is smaller, is also like a part of the brain that plays that role in their social and cognitive areas. ADHD in the brain. ADHD has a distinct link to an environmental toxin, lead. Symptoms are caused by the brain's inconsistent processing of sensory input. And there may also be a maturational delay in the brain up to 3 years. So that just basically means that a child could be 8, but if the brain is delayed by 3 years, so mentally they're a 5-year-old. And then the excess excitatory chemicals in the brain of ADHD children or people lead to hyperactivity and that impulse control. Biochemical influences on learning. ADHD and Tourette syndrome are believed to be caused by biochemical irregularities. Medicated students tend to improve in the accuracy and quantity of work produced. It's thought that Ritalin helps stimulate the circuitry in the brain. Biochemical irregularities can be influenced by pharmaceuticals, substances we eat, and things we drink. Stimulants used to treat ADHD are thought to affect the speed at which information is processed. Those stimulants can also suppress non-compliant, disruptive, and aggressive behaviors in ADHD individuals. Word there that I'm probably not going to pronounce right, so I'm just going to call it Ritalin, is also used to treat tics in children with Tourette syndrome. And the side effects of ADHD drugs can lead to decreased appetite, shakiness, and trouble with sleeping or increased sleepiness. Research on memory. So these are pretty basic, but first, in order to learn, students must be able to attend to a stimuli, encode information about that stimuli, integrate and store the data from that in memory, and then be able to retrieve the data as they're needed. So basically, they're able to, they see a stimuli, and they take the information from that, and their brain encodes it, puts it, integrates it, and stores it in their memory, and then retrieves it when they need to, like on a test, they need to be able to say what the correct answer is, so then they retrieve it from their memory. But LD students can have deficits in these specific areas. Yeah. So in each step, a student could have a deficit in one or more of those. Memories are stored in the hippocampus, part of the brain, and chemical messages communicated in the hippocampus change when memory is stored. Memories are controlled by chemical signals in the brain that are triggered by learning. Research has shown that quieter classrooms will benefit all students. Many teachers have now adapted to using a technique called white music, which just means soothing instrumental music that's played softly, and it will mask the incidental noise in the room. Ways to improve LD students' memory. You can use visual supports. Making connections between new information and prior experiences is a big one. Providing practice for students to learn how to move memory from short-term to long-term, or move information from short-term to long-term memory. And then periodic reinforcement through use will maintain what is learned in the working memory. Metacognition. So metacognition refers to the knowledge and control individuals have over their own thinking and learning. Metacognition is an active process where individuals examine information and make decisions regarding the best way to learn it. At ages 5 to 7, children benefit when the teacher uses rote drill to help them memorize the alphabet and cite words. In the beginning and first grade, so these are just the techniques that are used at different age levels to help with metacognition. And then in 5 to 7, it's rote drill. And then in first grade, they start using they're taught how to make predictions, and then by age 8, children can be taught how to visualize and verbalize techniques. In late third/early fourth grade, students can use note-taking as a skill, and then verbal self-mediation is an organizational strategy that involves talking to yourself about the steps you need to take to get something done. And then mnemonics, if I'm saying that right. Instruction is extremely helpful for LD students because for memorizing new information by hooking information to known information, so that new information to prior experience. And then mapping and graphic organizers are useful visual techniques to help students organize information from a text, either before, during, or after reading it. So, phonological processing problems. So we talked about these briefly, but phonological processing problems is when there's difficulties with the way the brain processes sounds in order of language. Often the first sign of phonological processing problems is delayed speech. When there is a speech delay, there tends to also be a corresponding reading and language issue. So phonologically based reading disabilities, so PRD, are characterized by difficulties acquiring alphabetic or phonetic reading strategies. So children with PRD are slow to acquire their sight words, so words that they should be able to look at and just know what they are. And then children with LD have difficulties perceiving the temporal order of speech stimuli. Phonological processing problems can cause children to have trouble consistently spelling words correctly. So they need consistent explanation of the letter-sound relationship. It's very helpful instruction. Some children will still grow up and never learning to spell. This is often the case with individuals with severe dyslexia. Phonological processing occurs in the left temporal area of the brain. Anomalies in this area occur in utero around the 5th month of gestation and appear to be genetically dictated, so these problems occur in the brain while the baby is developing in utero, and they appear to be genetically dictated. For those who are dyslexic, it is the right anterior portion of the cerebellum that is anatomically different. So remediation. One of the most successful ways of remediating phonological processing problems is with reading is with explicit and repeated discussion of phonetic principles. It's wise to use assistive technology for age-appropriate content matter. Very helpful. And then children who have trouble with phonological processing may also have trouble with following oral directions, reading aloud in class, and interpreting vocal instructions. Children with these problems benefit from visual cues for instructions, directions, and assignments. Timeline of LD law. So, here are some major events that occurred with LD. So the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which was in 1975, entitled All Children to a Free and Appropriate Education in the Least Restrictive Environment, so FAPE and LRE, protected rights of children with disabilities and their parents. It's now revised under and appropriated under IDEA. Then the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, was first in 1990. There was a revision, I think, in 1997 too, and then a 2000 revision. So it's designed to provide government services for those with disabilities in the field of education. Criteria set forth at a government level, and the child must fit that criteria. Extended services for children 2 to 5 years with special needs, so they can get more services. And then it's enforced by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education. Section 504 Civil Rights Act, 1973, to prevent discrimination against those with disabilities in programs that receive federal funding. It doesn't have a very specific criteria to receive services. Well, it's specific, but it's not as specific as the other ones. It does not require parental consent. It does require a plan set by individuals in the school district, and it is enforced by the U.S. Office of Civil Rights. No Child Left Behind was in 2000. So, school accountability to governmental entities regarding student progress. Schools must submit an annual yearly report for public viewing, which you can find on your state government's website. And then annual assessments for grades 3 to 8 are mandated, and funding can be revoked based on the school's progress. Parental rights and the law. Parents have the right to require confidential treatment for their child's record, so only a limited group of people in the school can access them. They can review and inspect records. They can have copies of all records and any documentation regarding their child on file with the school. So any document, any record with the school, they can have a copy of. They can release records to non-school personnel when permission is obtained by the school in writing. Be notified in advance 10 days of any meeting pertaining to their child, and they may bring anyone they wish to the meeting, and they may tape record meetings. And they can also request an assessment for their child. More rights, they can be appraised of the assessment tools that are being used, and the child they have the right to have their child assessed in their own language. They can request an independent evaluation at the public's expense if they do not agree with the district's evaluation. They have to. This is something very important. They have input in the development of the IEP. They can refuse the services or placement in special education. They can have independent, fully paid private school placement if it is deemed necessary to meet the child's need. And they can request and have a fair hearing if disagreements arise in regarding to identification, placement, or services. So comparison of IDEA and Section 504. So IDEA, the purpose, it's a federal statute to ensure appropriate services for disabled children. Funding, it's provides additional funds for eligible students. So purpose of Section 504, civil rights law to protect the rights of individuals with handicaps and programs that receive federal funding. And then funding, it doesn't provide any additional funding. So the scope of IDEA, all school-age children fall into these categories, and it gives you a list of those categories, like specific learning disability, mental retardation, speech impaired, emotionally disturbed, other health impaired, multiple handicapped, deaf or hearing impairment, visually impaired, traumatic brain injury, autism, and deafblind. And then Section 504, the scope of that is all school-age children qualified as handicapped who have or have had a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So enforcement of IDEA, it's from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education. And then accessing evaluation requires written notice to parent and informed parent consent, just to be written consent from the parent, and then full comprehensive evaluation by a multidisciplinary team. And then Section 504 enforcement is the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, and accessing information requires a notice to parents, and it suggests written, but no formal evaluation decisions made by a group of, so no formal evaluation decisions are solely made up by a group of knowledgeable professionals, and they could also be the same people who serve on an IEP team. So IDEA, placement reevaluation is not required for a change of placement. Changes in IEP team review decision. And then Section 504 placement reevaluation is required for a significant change of placement. And then both of these require thorough documentation and due process, which means requires impartial hearing for parents or guardians who disagree with the identification, evaluation, and placement. So they have both of those. So parents as advocates. It's well known that parents know their children best, but using that knowledge to get services can be hard. So one thing you can do is you can go online. You can find information very quickly that way. Some different places that you can look are so Learning Disabilities Association gives you the link there. They provide information on educational legislation. They can give you sample letters to send to schools, and then information on different types of learning disabilities. Reading Rockets, they produce online videos that spell out the advocacy process. And then Rights Law, they put on training seminars, they offer advocacy information online, and they also have books that are on legal issues and advocacy for children with LD. So students' rights. Students have the right to receive due process if they get in trouble at school, and the students shall know their charges. They can be heard in defense of self and have the right to review all documents that support the charges. Be treated at all times with respect and courtesy by all members of the school staff. Receive a prompt hearing if they are suspended or face expulsion or involuntary transfer. They have the right to a safe learning environment, a free and appropriate education, FAPE, and they can be provided accommodations for their learning disabilities. So the teacher's rights and obligations. Teachers have the right to work in a safe environment, be treated respectfully by their students, and be able to teach. However, teachers can remove a student for being disrespectful or using profanity, and teachers must report assaults. Teachers have an obligation to notify parents before beginning the evaluation process to set up an IEP, and they have to follow the guidelines set forth in the IEP. Teachers should realize that parents have the right by law to access copies of anything teachers have that would be added to a student's file. Purpose of a behavior intervention plan. So when an IEP is written, the student's social, emotional, behavioral needs need to be considered. The IEP team needs to write in the IEP the methods teachers will use to address these issues. If a student has trouble following school or classroom rules, the school's psychologist should evaluate the child's behavioral needs. And then a meeting should be scheduled to create a behavioral intervention plan or a BIP. And then each person involved with the child should receive a copy of this plan, which is a legally binding contract. The procedures must be followed, and it will be included with the IEP. Most of the time after a BIP is created, it will be stapled to the IEP. Suspension and expulsion rights. Students can only be suspended for a cumulative period of 10 days. Before the 11th suspension, the IEP team must meet to either write a BIP or review and revise the current BIP. When deciding if a suspension is justified, due process officers look at how the school dealt with each infraction. What they specifically look at, were teachers actually working with the student on behavioral goals? If so, how often? What action did the principal take? Were the nature and severity of the offense considered before suspension was invoked? And would another alternative have been more appropriate? A pre-expulsion IEP meeting must be held before an expulsion can occur. At this meeting, 3 questions have to be answered. Is the student appropriately placed? Is all FAPE paperwork up to date? And is there any link between the behavior and the disability? So they have to answer those questions before they can actually expel a student. However, schools can place a student in an alternative placement without parent permission for up to 45 days for drug or weapons offenses. So if a student is involved in anything drug or weapon related, they can be removed from the school for up to 45 days, and they do not need parent permission to do this. What is a MET? So a MET is a multidisciplinary evaluation team. An MET is part of the evaluation-reevaluation process to determine eligibility for special education services. The minimum of 2 people responsible for the evaluation usually includes 1 special education teacher and another specialist. After the evaluation, the MET meets to look at the data and determine if the child meets eligibility requirements. The MET report is presented to the IEP team, and students already receiving services must be reevaluated for eligibility every 3 years. What is REED or READ? READ is a review of existing evaluation data. READ may include a child's classroom work, performance on state or district assessments, and information provided by parents. The purpose is to decide if the existing data is sufficient to establish the child's eligibility and determine educational needs. What is an IEPT? So an IEPT is the IEP team, which are the individuals involved in writing an IEP. By law, certain individuals must be involved, so parents, at least one special education teacher, at least one general education teacher, if the child is in the general education setting, a representative of the school system, an individual who can interpret evaluation results, so the MET, representatives of other agencies that may be paying for or providing transition services. This is if the child is 16 years of age, and they can be younger if it's deemed appropriate. And then the student as appropriate, so based on their age, and then other individuals who have a knowledge or special expertise about the child. So an initial IEP. So an initial IEP is the first IEP meeting where the IEPT determines the initial eligibility for special education services. This has to include a MET member to present the MET report. So a transition IEP, there's a lot going on here. So beginning no later than the first IEP to be in effect when the student is 16, and this is updated annually. So if you're creating an IEP and the student is going to turn 16 within that IEP year, they have to have transitions in there, which means the IEP must include appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals based upon appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, independent living skills, and transition services, including courses of study needed to assist the student in reaching those. It's recommended to consider beginning at age 13, doesn't have to be, and the IEP may include a statement of transition services needed, focusing on a course of study, and this has to be updated at least annually. This is a statement that will focus on the student's course of study, if they need advanced placement or vocational programs, and the IEP may determine what instruction and educational expertise or experiences will assist the student to prepare for a transition from secondary education to post-secondary life. So an annual review. Annual review is a review of the IEP that must occur once a year. Parents and staff review the student's progress, share what the student has accomplished, and write goals for the next year. The principal, special education teacher, general education teacher, and other service providers, occupational therapists, psychologists, meet with the parent/guardian during the annual review. So a reevaluation IEP. So a reevaluation IEP has to be conducted once every 3 years to determine if a student is still eligible for special education services, unless the parent and local education agency, LEA, agree that the reevaluation is unnecessary. This may also include for other reasons, like determining the appropriateness of the current or proposed program/services, and an MET is not required unless considering an additional change in disability. So if you're just doing a reevaluation to determine if they're in the right classroom setting, then that's perfectly okay. But if you're going to add a disability or change a disability, then you need to have an MET occur. So what is a manifestation determination? Manifestation determination is, this is the definition, a review of the relationship between a student's misconduct and a disability. IDEA 2004 requires a Manifestation Determination Review, or MDR, by the IEP team within 10 school days of any decision to change the placement of the student with a disability because of violation of student code of conduct. So this would have to do with like suspensions. So if a student is suspended for 10 days, then they have to do the MDR in order to do an 11th suspension. And it says that here a school district must hold that when a single removal exceeding 10 consecutive school days, or a pattern of removals that are cumulative to more than 10 school days. And school day means any day, including a partial day, so even a half day, the students are in attendance at school for instructional purposes. So anytime a student misses, whether it's a half day, a full day of school, if they are in attendance and their removals are either 10 consecutive, so 10 in a row, or just 10 that add up to that, then they have to do the MDR. So what is a due process hearing? So when issues between parents and schools cannot be resolved, parents have the right to have the matter reviewed, mediated, and settled through due process. Actually, both the school district and parents can initiate this process, and the process is called an impartial hearing. It's designed to hear both sides of the issue and try to resolve it fairly with a third party. Most disagreements are resolved before this point due to time and money concerns for both parties. So, in addendum to the IEP, the purpose is to make minor changes to the IEP during the year it's in effect. If substantial or comprehensive changes need to be made in the IEPT meeting, or an IEPT meeting should be held to develop a new complete IEP team report. The addendum may not be used for the following: to determine/redetermine special education eligibility, to change the type of program for the student, or to exit the student from special education. So basically, it would just be like adding a goal or taking a goal away because, you're not going to reach that. So it's just minor changes to the IEP. It's not anything substantial, like it is during the reevaluation process. So, and then progress reporting. So what is that? Progress reporting is a practice that is used to assess students' performance and evaluate the effectiveness of instruction. So progress reporting works by a few different steps. So first, the student's current level of performance are determined and goals are identified for learning that will take place over time. And then the student's academic performance is measured on a regular basis. This could be weekly or monthly. And then progress toward meeting the student's goals is measured by comparing expected and actual rates of learning. So where you actually wanted them to be and where they are. And then based on these measurements, the teaching is adjusted, and thus the student's progression of achievement is monitored, and instructional techniques are adjusted to meet the individual students' learning needs. So the IEP must include for progress reporting how a child's progress will be measured, and then when periodic reports on a child's progress will be provided. And it is a law that progress reports have to be provided at least as often as parents of non-disabled children. So that means when general education students would receive their report cards. But the IEP team can decide that more frequent reporting is needed in order to make informed decisions about teaching methods for that child. So they could the minimum is that they have to do a report when report cards would go out for general ed students, but they can definitely do those reports more. And then progress reporting is also a part of response to intervention. And then here are my lovely sources. My first source is my book for class. Then the rest of them are websites. One of them was a PDF document, the first one, about IEP laws from the Michigan Department of Education. And then I actually used, they talk about it in the book Reading Rockets. I used that website to get some information. And then I used a website, basically it's the same website, but I used 3 different pages from that, so I just copied those URLs. So it's the Michigan Alliance for Families, and I found this website through the Michigan Department of Education, and they have a lot of good stuff that is directly from like the laws. So that's where I got some information on all that.